thank you for being here tonight. We know how important it is to make our kids flourish in today's environment. The social media, external pressures, the school and what they do to pressure kids. And we know at the school level the need for care for mental health of our kids. So much so that the district has made a commitment to partner with Children's Hospital for school-based therapists, and Dr. Gilman is a big part of that. We had a conference call last week about one here at the high school, and we're narrowing that down. And when that happens, we'll push out information to all the high school parents. And I know we have all levels here, but tonight it is our privilege to have Dr. Rich Gilman talk to you. He's talked to our staff on several occasions. He's an expert in this field, and we rely on him a lot. And I will let him tell you his pedigree and everything that he is all about. So, Dr. Gilman.
Thank you. Well, you haven't heard me yet, but now you're putting anxiety on me. Thank you for coming. Look, it's a weeknight. It's 6:30. A lot of things going on. The fact that you're here means a lot, so I appreciate it. If you can tell, some of you may have picked up the fact that I'm not from Cincinnati. I'm from the great north, South Dakota. Are you familiar with South Dakota? Most of you, if you know, you probably drove through it. But there's 3 people in that state. Since I'm here, they have to shut it down for 8 hours. Okay, if that didn't get a laugh, this is going to be a long night. I appreciate you coming. But one of the reasons I'm bringing this up is I hate hearing myself talk for more than 15 minutes at a time. That's not what this is all about. I want this to be a monologue, dialogue, rather than a monologue. So please feel free to ask questions as we go along, make statements. I want to learn from you and about this community, since we are now part of this community. We're very privileged and honored to be serving the students, not only at the high school, where we're starting, but also in the elementary and the middle school. So by way of introduction, I'm a professor at the UC Medical School. I'm co-director of PTSD Center at the medical school, and I'm the director of all school-based mental health services that we have in Cincinnati. And that it comprises, and I'm sorry, you're going to know I'm moving all around. That comprises not only Sycamore, Madeira, Indian Hill, Lebanon, Lakota, parts of CPS, Oak Hills. We just keep moving on. So one of the things that we are so proud of and so grateful for to be partnering with Sycamore is the opportunities to do something we've always wanted to do. And that was to talk about the complete state of mental health. That is so important. By way of just hands, let's talk about why we're here, right? Now the idea here is mental health flourishing. What is the goals you want to see your student have when they're 18 and beyond? What are the goals you want them to learn now so that they can flourish when they're adults? What would that be? Self-confidence, good.
Cool-headed. Cool-headed.
Cool-headed, very good, yes. Coping skills.
Time management and judgment.
Good. Anything else? Personal accountability?
Independence.
Independence. Personal accountability? Critical thinking. Would those be some of the other ones? You know, it's really interesting. I even ask teachers the same question. I never once say, I want my student to have a 4.0 in reading. That's kind of, that's just expected, right, as we go along. But these overarching goals is so important. None of you mentioned, I don't want my student not to suffer from adversity. It's how to go beyond adversity. It's how to cope with adversity. By way of hands, how many of you have had an adverse experience in your own life? We don't have to talk about it, but you learned from that experience. And you actually became maybe better for it, but you learned something about yourself. How many of you have gone through that? Wow, that seems to be all hands. Nobody's immune to adversity. That's not what this is all about. When we work with our students, it's not just to talk to them, it's to teach them skills and coping skills to work through whatever problem they have. But in order to do that, we have to think about what are some of the skills we want to make sure that they get. Am I right? And the skills we want are the very skills you're talking about. So why are we focusing so much on mental health? And when we say mental health, we actually think mental illness. Why is that? That's how I make my money. I mean, nobody comes to me and they say, I want to increase my resiliency. They want to reduce their mental distress. But it's not both sides of the coin. It's one and the same in many respects. I'm going to walk you through this idea of what resiliency truly is. This idea of, have you heard this term positive mental health? It's a big thing out there, and I want to talk through that as well. So over the past 30 years, I've devoted my research looking at what are the indicators that we should be focusing on to get our students to the ultimate goal, the very goals that you've mentioned. So if you will allow me for the next hour and a half, I'll walk you through this, but again, I don't want this a monologue. I want this to be a dialogue. My goal is to have you walk away with perhaps some skills that you may want to try even at home and certainly at school. So let's talk about this whole concept of health. I am from Cincinnati Children's Hospital. We focus on health. But health, the definition of health, of course, has changed throughout the decades. In the early days when we thought about health, considering where we were, and Cincinnati, of course, was here in the 1800s, what do we know about health? We knew about survival. The ultimate goal was to survive, considering the unsanitary conditions that we've had, not only in Cincinnati, but across the world. And just as a thing, what was the average life expectancy rate 100 years ago from today? What was it?
45.
How many of you said 47? I would have been dead by now. That was the ultimate, that was the average, right? But the idea here is we were focusing about 100 years ago on the medical model, and we needed to understand how can we eradicate disease in order to promote health, increase longevity. And so health was in the 1900s associated with these interactions between the social environment, water, our food, all these things. There's no surprise in 100 years ago when the antitrust movement was coming around was to break, and one of the things was health promotion, the health in terms of survivability. But you know what was happening in that time? We continued to get older, we continued to live longer, and we continue to think about, it's not just living, it's the quality of life that we have. That's the important thing. And so 1947 was the first time the World Health Organization, which up to that point was really just focusing on survival, really started to think about the external components. What are the things that we define health? And so of course, they were the first one to come with this idea of a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. That's the term. Have you heard of well-being? I'm going to throw these things out. But the idea here is they finally started to move away from survival to more quality of life. The 60s and 70s of this whole resiliency movement that we see today that's where the roots were. How many of you grew up in the 1960s? What a great decade to live in. I wish I was born in the 60s, but I wish I knew a little bit more, because that's where really the focus was moving away from survival to looking at what are the aspects that we need in order to really think about our lives overall. And here we are now. The whole movement towards health is not just survivability, it's not just physical health, but it's along a continuum. And the continuum that's still embraced by the World Health Organization, among other things, it's not you're either healthy or unhealthy. You're not whole, you're not damaged, you're along a continuum. Now the reason I'm bringing this up is I'm revisiting this, in probably 15 more minutes, I'm revisiting this whole framework of a continuum of mental health. One is not one or the other. There is a gradation that goes along the way. And where we are, we don't know. Do you know what your blood pressure is right now as you sit? Do you know what your heart rate is right now as you sit? Do you know what your mental health is as you sit? We'd like to think that our blood pressure is 120/80. We'd like to think that our heart rate is around 55. And we'd like to think that we're fine. But you know, they just did a study about three months ago. 90% of the adults had no idea where they fit until they had some sort of standard in which to compare against. I'm not saying none of us are crazy, I'm not saying that. But we really don't know where we are. We'd like to think we know where we are. The idea is how can we measure vital components to see exactly where we stand? And we start with students. That's where my research is. Can we develop a system in which we can start identifying where students fall along this continuum? That's the ultimate goal. So, we've heard this whole idea of positive mental health. Have you heard of this? That's a big thing, positive mental health. And I'd like to think that I and some of my research colleagues and our mentors, we really formed this in the mid-1990s. It's been around for many years. But really, it took hold in the 1970s and certainly the 1980s and 90s about a reaction against this assumption that positive mental health is automatically enhanced as you treat psychopathology. If you can get rid of somebody's depression, they feel better. What do you think? Is that true or false? It's not. In fact, we know that. We know that even when we treat our students. Just as background, the students when we work with students, we have a curriculum that we follow. It's a very powerful curriculum. In 12 sessions or less, we can get depression and anxiety down to sub-threshold levels. They can recover from those things. In 12 sessions or less, because we are teaching them skills and they have to practice over and over, no different than any other skill that they've learned. If they can practice all these skills over and over, chances are they're going to recover from whatever mental distress they're facing. But do they necessarily feel good about their lives? Chances are it's not. Chances are they're still finding some malaise. So even though they're feeling better about themselves, there's still some aspects we have to think about too. So just because they're recovered from mental disease or mental illness doesn't necessarily mean they're recovering on the other side of the coin. So the aim here is not to supplant the focus on pathology, but it's to really start focusing on what constitutes healthy adaptive function. So the idea for us as psychologists, therapists, among other things, yes, we can get the depression below threshold, but what else are we doing from that other aspect, that other end of the continuum, to increase their thriving and their flourishing? That's the key to this whole resilience improvement. Does that make sense? Okay, so far I've talked for 10 minutes. You got 5 more minutes before I have to hear a question. All right? So, we know that many students, in general, this is a very broad base, in general, 10 to 20% of every school population is going to be suffering from some sort of psychological distress to the point where it warrants some sort of intervention. Whether that's depression, whether that's anxiety, whether that's, you name it, they got it. 10 to 20% of every school is going to be facing that. We know that. All right? But we also know that there's a lot of students who have been struggling, who have faced adversity just like you said. And yet not all of those students are going to end up warranting some sort of psychological intervention. Let's think about PTSD, for example. Are you familiar with the term PTSD? Post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder, there's many myths around PTSD. One myth, of course, is that once you get it, it's hard to get rid of. That's not true. It's actually one of the most treatable diseases, if you want to call it a disease. It's basically anxiety on steroids. It's one of the most treatable. And our data suggests that. It's how it used to be treated. And how it used to be treated was just talk therapy. Nothing wrong with talk therapy, it's great. But we weren't teaching the individual who was suffering from PTSD skills to work through their problems. It's amazing what happens when you have a skills development, skills-focused curriculum, and how that PTSD goes back down. But let's say, for instance, all of you, if you don't mind being a little bit morbid, got into a car accident. So all of you, at time one, would have suffered a lot of distress. How many of you do you think would have PTSD? All of you? That's another myth. Just because you're facing trauma, you automatically get something as heinous as PTSD. It's not true. If I was to clone one of you 100 times and put you in that situation, that unfortunate situation, all 100 of you at time one, I'm pointing to some, I don't know what I'm pointing at, but go along with it, is that you would have really high distress over time. But over the period of weeks, 86 of you will have low distress. Your stress will recover. The brain is amazing. I'm going to walk you through what the brain is all about. The brain has an amazing ability to recover itself if we allow it to. If we have resilient aspects to allow it to recover itself. But that 14% stays up here. We're not allowing the brain to recover. One of the aspects of that is that there's little resiliency to that. I'm going to walk you through what resiliency is. Not everybody has to get psychological illness or diagnosis, even in the face of adversity. If we allow our brains to recover, it will recover. It will do a wonderful job for us. But we need to have resiliency aspects. I'll show you in just a second what those resiliency aspects are and how we can improve them in our own children. Make sense? Any questions? Because I'm going to go over here and get myself a cup of coffee. You guys all right? Am I just wowing you? Are you taking it all in? Or is it the visual presentation? I can't do anything about this look. I mean, if you want, just close your eyes and pretend I'm Brad Pitt. I know I do. Wow, these jokes are just falling flat. So what is this thing we talk about resiliency? What is this all about? We use resiliency interchangeably. Basically, of course, it's the ability of any organism, it doesn't have to be us as adults, to adapt, to withstand challenges to its stability. Basically, you have to have an adverse response. Now, here's the other myth about resiliency and adversity. We used to think adversity had to be this massive thing, like a car accident, like sexual assault. It doesn't happen. It's in the eye of the beholder. Any one of us would have had an adverse experience and somebody else would look, really? To that person, that's an adverse situation. So if you didn't raise your hand, and I don't think none of you did, but if you didn't raise your hand, think about other aspects you could define as adversity. We've all faced adversity. What do we do? There are mediating processes that allow us to get to this better than expected outcomes. Look, when we're in these situations, adverse situations, it stinks. How many of you have your son or daughter break up with somebody? It's not fun. Okay, how many of you broke up with somebody? It's probably better. I'll make it more personal. It was not fun. It stunk, didn't it? And in those moments, if you can think about that, could you see your future? Could you see your future as bright? I'm not talking about these normal, I'm talking about you fell in love, it was wonderful, and it just didn't work. In those moments, those are the worst moments, right? We can't see the future ahead of us, oftentimes. We cannot see the idea that I'm actually going to get better because of this. But that's really what resiliency is. It's the idea of taking an adverse experience, applying some resiliency aspects to it, and we come out better than we were before. How do we do that? Well, let's talk a little about this idea of stress. Now here is where it applies to everyone. And again, I'm going to walk you through, I'm going to take the neuroscience of all this, I'm going to try to just sift all that stuff out that you read in magazines and get to the core of it, okay? We know, for example, stress, i.e. adversity, that's inevitable. We think we've all established that. That's postulate one. We've all established adversity. Number one is we all have a certain amount of stress, and believe it or not, a little bit of stress is good for us. We need it. We need it to be good. For those of us who are working under the gun of some time frame, a little bit of adversity, a little bit of stress really helps us. Not too much, but of course the opposite side, if you have nothing, I want to meet that person. I want to meet the person who has no stress in their lives. I've never met him yet. That's my life goal, because I want to see what happens. I think they're dead. It's the only time. We all have some stress, and there's nothing wrong with that one. The beneficial aspects of stress diminish when it's severe enough to overwhelm the adolescent or the student's ability to cope effectively. And there's really three types of stress I'm talking about. And I want to tell you what stresses I'm not talking about versus what stresses I am talking about. I'm not talking about positive stress. That's just short-lived adverse experiences, right? Car gets a flat tire. It's an adverse thing. It's an inconvenience. It's an annoyance. It's a short-term stress. We're going to be able to deal with that. In fact, we didn't even register that. I just had my car's tire blow out on me at the Kroger store about 6 months ago, at the coldest day of the year. Was it about 6 months ago? Yeah. Coldest day. The only thing I remember is I got to change and go. I don't really remember what it was like when I was back in that moment. I don't remember that. We don't really register that kind of stress. We do register the tolerable aspects of stress. And these are adverse experiences. They're more intense, but they're still relatively short-lived. In the moment, it stinks. In the moment, it's awful. The death of a loved one, of course. A natural disaster, these kind of things. But we get better over that time. What I want to talk about is the toxic stress. It's these intense adverse experiences that may be sustained over a long period of time, because that links to other things, anxiety, among others. Does that make sense? That's what I want to talk about in just a second. What's that a picture of? It's a good picture of the brain, and if I had an opportunity to draw you my picture of the brain, I would, because I'm an excellent artist, but everybody makes fun of me because it never looks like the brain. But I want to walk you through, how many of you have ever had an anxious moment? Did all of you? I hope so. Okay, so you've all had an anxious moment. So I need a volunteer right now. Yeah, I don't need a volunteer. But how many of you thought, uh-oh, I knew this was coming when he was going to ask for a volunteer? What was that feeling like? Is he going to call on me? You ever been in one of these shows where they are looking for volunteers and you pray to God they don't look at you? You just do whatever you can not to watch their eyes. That anxious moment. I want you to focus on that moment because it's going to make it more clear about what I'm talking about. In that moment, anxiety. So I'm going to walk you through what the brain is doing during that time. So how many of you have driven to this high school before? You probably drove here tonight, right? And how many of you took the same route? So were you really focusing on getting here? No, you were focusing on other things because you've done this over and over and over again. It's been predictable for you. You can anticipate things. But let's say tonight you were driving, it's daytime, you're driving along, and out of the corner of your eye comes a car, red car, so it's going to catch your eye. It's coming a little bit too fast to the intersection, and it's going to meet you. You anticipate it's going to meet you. What are you going to do with that information? What are you going to do? You're going to react. You're going to attend to it. You're going to attend to it. You don't even want to, you just do it. You know where that starts. So I'm going to walk you through 3 areas of the brain where all this works. Because this all goes back to adversity and stress, okay? We got to understand the stress response before we can understand the resiliency side. Make sense? All right, so first things first, if you take your brain, is anybody a neuroscientist in this? Thank God. Okay, I had one in the audience one time, and I had to spend 15 minutes after my talk going, yes, I understand that, but that's not where I want to. So take your finger, if you go up your spine and go right to the back of your head, that's a very important part of the brain, by the way. It's the oldest part of your brain. And you don't even know it's a brain, it is your brain. The oldest part, every organism has this part of your brain. It's called the brainstem. Brainstem is responsible for things like heartbeat, blood pressure, all these things you're not even aware of. So when I was asking you that question, are you truly aware of your blood pressure? No, you don't. Nobody does that. But this thing does, and if this thing is monitoring everything we're not constantly keeping an eye on, and every organism has it, what do you think it's ultimately responsible for? Keeping you alive, right? What's our number one instinct? It's just living creatures. Survival. Number one instinct. Number 2 is reproduction. We have to survive before we can reproduce. Number 1. So this is where that response to the red car was happened right here. You didn't even know it was happening. It was doing it for you because it's constantly searching for threats. And if there is a threat, something unpredictable, something unanticipated, it is going to attend to that. You have no control over that, right? So if an organism is in the threat situation, they're going to be programmed to do 1 of 3 things. So if a lion is threatened, what's a lion going to do? Attack. And a gazelle? And are you familiar with possums? Right, they're going to play dead. Fight, flight, freeze. Happens right here. Every organism is programmed to do 1 of those 3. But do you know what's really interesting about human beings? We can do 1 of those things. We do have a choice. Some of it, of course, is genetically transmitted from our parents, but a lot of it has to do with our observational model of our world around us. So, how many of you are married? And if you get in an argument, what's your first basic reaction you want to do? You want to argue back? You want to leave the room? Or you just don't know? It depends. Exactly. It always is going to depend on the context. We know that. But there is a typical response we have. So when I get in an argument with my wife, I need to argue back. I need to argue back because there is something about me that needs to fight back. Yes, I could walk away. Yes, I could just freeze. That's what my wife wants me to do. But I just need to do this. Now, what's really interesting about all those things is that this brainstem of ours, it doesn't know what a threat, whether it's physical or psychological. It just knows a threat. So a memory can be a threat. So I have an argument with my wife, and I'd like to have you help me solve this argument, please. I think that there are fundamental rules that we all have, and when one of those rules are broken, that's when we go into threat situation. Psychological threat, not physical threat. I think that we all have a fundamental need to belong, we all have a fundamental need to look good, and we all have a fundamental need to be right. If you get in the argument with your spouse, which one of those things will violate? And my wife argues with me. She says, no, there's a 4th one. There's a need for justice. So how many of you are siding with my wife? And how many of you don't think there's a need for justice? How many of you just don't care? So if you think about every time your child is going into an anxiety moment or just distress of some kind, just think through which one of these rules is being violated. It's a really good, subtle way of understanding their world and our world too. Think about the next time when you're under distress. Okay, which one of these rules is being violated? Try it out. But the idea, the need to belong as a fundamental need. Think about how many times, think what is the impact, what is the appeal of Facebook? Do I really need to see your recipes? Do I really need to send my recipes? There's a fundamental rule that it's typing into. That's I think, the brilliance of Facebook. It's connection, right? So the need to belong, the need to look good, and it doesn't have to be just physically. I want to look good in front of people, and the need to be right. And when I'm not looking right, especially as a parent myself, yeah, I get a little upset. So those three, and then my wife argues that there's the need for justice. I tend to agree. So the idea is, it starts here. It starts in the brainstem. And that thing's going to do this. It's going to start buzzing. Anytime we're in a threat situation. So the idea here, that's where it starts. And all that other stuff. Now, it's covered by this stuff, but if you don't do this at home, if you take a pencil, go down about 6 inches from the top of your head, there is a small part of your brain that is about 1/8 of your thumbnail. It's really small, but it's very powerful, and that's where our emotions are stored. Has anybody ever seen the movie Inside Out? Can you tell me the characters of Inside Out? What are the characters? Sadness, joy, anger, fear. You always forget. Oh, God. Disgust, good. That's all right. I love doing that one. I always pray when I give these talks that nobody's going to get disgust, so I can just do that one. Disgust, yes. Those are the 5. Our brains can only process those 5 basic emotions. It's no different than a color palette. Those are our 5 primary emotions. Now, of course, we have other emotions, but they're usually blends. So what do you think jealousy is? Fear and anger. Yeah, that's what we think jealousy is. So they're secondary emotions. But it all starts right about here. Now, the reason I'm bringing these 2 things up is they're linked. When that red car comes, we're not only going to react to it, we will experience an emotion. We're just not understanding what that emotion is. It will link to that. Let's say, for instance, we've been in a car accident, a severe car accident. What emotions do you think the individual will experience by being in a car accident? Fear, right? That's pretty common. And we used to think, another myth of PTSD or trauma, for example, that it's all in your head. It is not in your head. At time 1, when that car was coming at that person, that brainstem was going, it literally carved a channel in our neurons to the fear network. So that any reminder after that, what emotion is that person going to face? Same emotion, fear. It's no different than anything else. Think about any time you've been in an embarrassing moment. How many of you ever been in an embarrassing moment, right? Think about that initial emotion. Think about the memories of that emotion, of that event. What emotions do you experience? Again, our brainstem doesn't know what's real. It doesn't know what's made up. It doesn't know what's physical. It doesn't know what's mental. It just knows threat. And it's going to respond like this. And it's going to link to the same emotion right here. Now, why is that important? Why is that important? So are you familiar with fMRIs? fMRIs are like MRIs, right? MRIs is that small little tube you got to go into. Makes a whole bunch of sounds. That kind of a thing, right? So the issue with the small MRIs is it's constantly taking pictures. And then it gives you a nice little thing. fMRI is looking at things in real time. So we've had people down at the UC Medical School, we've had people go into an fMRI. Now they're 65 years old, and they had something horrific happen to them when they were 10. They've been in car accident, sexual assault, what have you. It doesn't matter how you get PTSD, you just get it. So this is a half century later. We put it in that tube and we say one simple thing. We say, tell us what happened when you were 10. You will literally see that connection being made. That's how powerful this is. Any threat to us, it's going to do this, and it's going to link to an emotion. So how do we help our kids in that situation? Well, I'll tell you what the solution is, but here's where the problem is. This part right here, what do you think the frontal lobes is responsible for? It's our temples out. Frontal lobe is the most complex organism in the universe. There's nothing that beats our frontal lobes. And it's the slowest to develop. About age 25 or so, give or take a couple of years, is when it fully develops. So if it's fully developed, it really defines us as human beings. What do you think the frontal lobe is responsible for?
Reason.
Reason, very good. It's the boss of everything else. It keeps our emotions in check. It allows us to think through problems. So here's the problem, is when this up, and our emotions get too strong, our emotional center, remember when I said it's about 1/8 of our thumb, that little small thing? It actually sends a signal to our frontal lobe and it says, shut down, don't think. Now why in the world would it do anything like that? Why in the world would we allow our emotions to control, to shut down our frontal lobe at the very moment when we need our frontal lobe to function? Exactly. You're running in a jungle and a lion's chasing after you. What's the worst thing you can do? Think. That nanosecond of a lion of thinking, should I go this way or should I go that way, is enough time for the lion to literally eat you, right? How many of you are athletes? How many of you are baseball players? Yeah, you're standing at home plate, you got a fastball coming at you, what's the worst thing you can do? Think, right, you have to react. So there's moments when it's good to shut our brains down, and there are other moments when it's not good to shut our brains down. In moments when our students, when our children are acting like they're acting crazy, all that is their emotions, they're allowing their emotions to control them rather than they control their emotions. Does that make sense? That is the element of stress we're talking about. The element of stress, to think through the problem, is resilience. If we can control our stress levels, if we can control the frontal lobe and keep it firing even when we don't want it to fire, we've got half the battle won. And I mean that truly. So I've done this. This is just it in more science speak. But basically, when we can control our stress, we have the frontal lobe working, the boss working. And if we can do that, all these resiliency skills that we're trying to teach our children will come into play. They can hear us. They can listen to themselves. But the problem is, oftentimes, is that those who have a hard time with stress, same situation, but again, what's happening is that the prefrontal cortex shuts down and we don't think. We're just a creature of reaction at that point. We are evolutionary in its finest detail. We are trying to survive that moment. Questions? Because I'm going to go get another piece of coffee, another drink of coffee. Good.
So that you're saying there's ways to break the cycle?
Yes. So when and this is good because we got a little bit of time. So can I ask you, when your child, adolescent, starts to really escalate, what's the thing you do in that situation? You say calm down. That's good. Is it effective?
No, it's worse than something. This is like imagine your wife, your husband tells you to calm down. And you calm down.
What else? Does anybody else say something to them, trying to reason with them? Take a breath. Good. Absolutely love it. Does it help? Do they have a ventilator?
Sometimes saying like imagine going to operation at this point of time, and then avoiding those moments or those kind of a situation where he or she might go through. And then it gives kind of connection. Once the connection is established, and then we say something.
That's good.
Becomes the
That's good. That's excellent. If that tells me this thing is still firing, they're listening to you. But I'll tell you something, there's a lot of other times when I'm trying to say, look, I can understand that they're really like, F you. I don't want to listen to anything you're telling me. That kind of a thing, right? So, you know when I said they don't think? I was lying to you. Of course we all think. We think in those moments. We just don't use the frontal lobe. We use another part of our brain. And that, you know what we do is using in that little brain? That brain is our memory center. And that brain has stored every negative, ugly thing that we have thought about ourselves, that we think others have thought about us, and it's like a little chest we've been carrying around, right? And we use that brain